Panelists and all of you for coming. Erwin Kotler pointed out in the early aughts, that's my term for the first decade of the 21st century, Erwin Kotler pointed out in the early aughts, quote, "It's not just that the Jewish people are the only people who are the standing target of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, but they are also the only people who are themselves accused of being genocidal." Let me rephrase that. Israel is the only country successfully accused in Western languages of being Nazis bent on genocide by people who, in their own tongues, admire the Nazis and wish to finish their job of exterminating the Jews. The success of this perverse Holocaust inversion, in both explicit and more subtle forms, represents a massive cognitive war victory for Palestinian irredentism and an equally disastrous loss for the progressive forces of peace. And a key moment in the widespread acceptance of this inverted narrative occurred at the turn of the century. We medievalists call it the millennium, beginning with the successful accusation that the IDF targeted and killed in his father's arms a young Palestinian boy allegedly named Muhammad Abdullah. And with the furious demonstrations in the West protesting the Jenin massacre that never happened in 2002. The results could be seen in the comments of two Jewish public intellectuals in 2003. In an op-ed in the New York Times in August of 2003, Ian Borman noted in passing that, quote, "The Palestinian cause has become the universal litmus test of liberal credentials." And this at a moment when the Palestinian cause was engaged in a terror war that really had no earlier example of such savagery specifically directed at civilians. How could liberals universally and uncritically accept and support such a savage cause when driven, they didn't know it, but those of us who pay attention knew that it was driven by apocalyptic hatreds? Paul Berman explained, "Each new act of terror and suicide testified to how oppressive were the Israelis. Palestinian terror in this view was the measure of Israeli guilt. The more grotesque the terror, the deeper the guilt." Or as one of my colleagues said to me one day when I came to campus looking concerned, and I said, "It's these terror attacks." And he said, "Yeah, what choice do they have?" The overwhelming sense that Israel is unjustifiably cruel to the Palestinians, gratuitously humiliating them, driving them to despair, pervades the way the news media covers the conflict. For those many journalists who participate in what Mati Friedman calls the cult of the occupation, the only obstacles to peace worth mentioning are the Israeli occupation and settlements. Palestinian incitement and terrorism are overlooked as driven by desperation. As Itamar Marcus pointed out in 2004, however, and largely in vain, it's aspiration, not desperation. Aspiration to destroy Israel that motivates, not desperation at having their own state and their human rights. I refer to this despair mentality in my book as liberal cognitive egocentrism, or the projection of one's own mindset onto people who do not share it. The liberal thinks, "I'd have to be terribly desperate to do such horrible things, and I would never aspire to exterminating another people, so how could the Palestinians?" And in a categorical error of confusing humane and human, they denounce anyone who describes the genocidal aspirations of the Palestinian leadership as a dehumanizing racist. The permanent reluctance of the news media to even raise the issue of Palestinian genocidal incitement, much less illustrate it, to reveal the Palestinian sympathies for the Nazis and hatreds of the U.S. reinforces this egocentric projection. Now, if this were only Israel at stake, one might understand, if not forgive, an outsider like my Harvard classmate who came to visit, saying, Israel is putting us all in danger. If you didn't poke the Islamic bear, we'd all be a lot safer. And yes, the only thing that would be safer, and even then only momentarily, would be the delusion that the Palestinian cause was noble, that Israel treated them horribly, and that if you feed the Israelis to the Islamist crocodile, you will be sated. At the height of the Jenin massacre on April 17, 2002, a Hamas preacher proclaimed the following, invoking the genocidal hadith of the rocks and trees. And I certainly hope everybody here knows what that hadith is. We all believe in this hadith. We are convinced also that this hadith, i.e. the extermination of the Jews, heralds the spread of Islam and its rule over the lands. Oh Allah, annihilate the Jews and their supporters. Oh Allah, raise the flag of jihad across the earth. Oh beloved, look to the east of the earth. Find Japan in the open ocean. Look to the west of the earth and find the country and the sea, and be assured that these will all be owned by the Muslim nation, as the hadith says, from ocean to ocean. Now, if never again means anything, it means that when some group preaches genocide from the pulpits, which the Nazis never did, and these genocidal sermons are then broadcast by the public authorities, that's news, relevant, and accurate. And when the advocates of this genocide see it as a prelude to world conquest, it's even crucial for the target of this imperial ambition, namely audiences in the West, to know about it. At such a juncture, one might think it was time for journalists to speak up. But no. The Jenin massacre meme was far too important to dwell on such trivialities. Which brings me to my final point. This isn't just about Israel or Palestine, however understood. As the above quote illustrates, Palestinian jihad, including the secular PLO, is a leading force in global jihad whose aim is world conquest. This is, of course, an unlikely ambition, like all millennial beliefs, unlikely to be realized, and many a cognitive egocentrist, like our journalists and even our own military intelligence, and here I'm speaking of Israeli military intelligence, will dismiss it as mad and assume that the vast majority of Palestinians and Muslims wouldn't fall for such nonsense. But as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao all showed us, being wrong where millennial beliefs are concerned hardly means being inconsequential. Rather, unopposed, it means the mass murder of tens of millions on the way to inevitable failure. So when we Israelis defend our cause, we also defend a society of decency and tolerance, or democracy, that is what Eli Sagan referred to as, quote, a near miracle. All of us who read or heard from our parents the story of the Emperor's New Clothes when we were young probably thought two things. One, it's a fairy tale, this kind of thing doesn't really happen. And two, it's a comedy. In the end, everybody's laughing at the Emperor and his courtiers. But no. First of all, Anderson doesn't tell us how the crowd reacted to the revelation of everyone's public stupidity. Indeed, in his initial ending of the story, no child speaks out. The Emperor returns pleasurably planning future such processions. If one considers what it means to have a ruling class so staggeringly stupid and in denial of reality as to parade a naked emperor in public, one can readily imagine that when this child spoke, at least some of the crowd wept in despair. And again, no, naked parades happen. And at least one prominent one has been going on for 2 decades. Only this time the drama surrounds not a naked emperor, but an icon of hatred, the Palestinian cause and its genocidal animosities and pitiless violence. In this scenario, the tailors are the Soviet propagandists and the Palestinian nationalists who insist only racists can't see the justice of their cause and its means. The foolish emperor is the progressive left who think they speak for the whole world. The chamberlain is Edward Said, or in the case of Abdullah, Charles Aldelan. The courtiers are the human rights NGOs, the town criers announcing the parade and grooming the public to cheer the emperor or the news media, and the crowd praising the emperor's guard are the liberal cognitive egocentrists, including the peace negotiators. And when the child in this case speaks up, Israel speaks up, his father, diaspora Jews, tells him to shut up. In the 20th century, the dark joke was anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than absolutely necessary. In the 21st century, it's hating Jews even though it's killing you. The apocalyptic analysis of what destroyed the Second Temple runs as follows. In the run-up to an apocalypse that will not happen, the world will go on, the mutual hatreds and hostilities have cosmic import. Only in the massive destruction that follows does it appear to those who survive as sinat chinam, as baseless hatreds. Today, Israelis and Jews around the world are being torn apart by the folly-driven tensions I am describing, which manifest not only in fights among diaspora Jews, the revolt against the woke behavior of the current Jewish leadership, and between diaspora Jews swept up in this woke wave, but now also in development in Israel. Some diaspora Jews no longer say the prayer for the state of Israel, about which, quote, we can no longer be proud. People speak in ominous tones about the death of democracy, and polarization intensifies. Whether we support it, oppose it, or don't know what to think about the proposed actions of our elected government, let us not lose sight of the fact that voting in Israel is deeply influenced by the massive hatreds that surround us, hatreds the whole world, including many Jews, refuse to acknowledge. It took the French Revolution 3 years to melt down to a paranoid terror that ate its own, and the Soviets and Maoists even less time, and all told, over 100 million people died from the madnesses of the last century. Israel is now 75 years into a revolutionary state, beset by murderous enemies, resisting that meltdown into mutual paranoia. But I can guarantee you that if these internecine hatreds, framed in apocalyptic all-or-nothing terms, what Erwin Kotler characterized euphemistically as counterproductive, succeed in destroying Jewish solidarity and, God forbid, Israel, the survivors will look back on these conflicts as another tragic example of sinat chinam. This book I have just published is my small contribution to both the voice of the child and the crowd, revealing the folly of those culture leaders who think the whole world cannot be wrong in its redemptive charge, and a call to arms in a civilizational war I truly believe we can still win. Let us this time not come out sadder and wiser. Let us become wiser now and come out glad. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It really is a privilege to be here this evening to help launch Richard's book. Richard's book is so very important, and in its analysis, which is unsparing, and its implications, it is absolutely devastating. It was Richard, under Richard's aegis, that I found myself in, 2007, sitting in a Paris court, watching in utter disbelief the hitherto untransmitted footage by France 2, which had published, which had transmitted the alleged murder, or not murder, the alleged killing of the boy Mohammed al-Dura in a so-called demonstration under heavy fire from the Israelis. And I watched in astonishment as what France 2 had concealed was footage which showed that what was supposed to be a demonstration under fire was in fact a carefully choreographed carnival featuring many cameras, producers, makeup artists, children on bicycles, and the famous framed footage which launched so many murders of Jews and others around the world, the footage of Muhammad al-Dura clinging to his father, slumping to the ground, with Charles Andelin, the France 2 presenter, saying, "Il est mort," and the hysteria, "Il est mort, il est mort." And then after that, we saw the child who was dead lift his head and do this. And at that moment, this terrible truth was revealed. Not only were the Palestinian Arabs indulging in what Richard so memorably termed Pallywood, but that the Western world's journalists not only transmitted this, but continued to maintain the lie, even though it was very obvious that it was indeed a lie. It is very hard to credit what Richard calls this lethal journalism, which refuses to see through the theatre of lies, the denial of facts, and the inversion of truth that constitutes so-called reporting of Israel and the Middle East. And as Richard explains in his book, as he attempts to explain this extraordinary phenomenon, it goes far wider and deeper than mere journalism. The context, I would suggest, is what we are all living through in our secular lives of the progressive agenda of identity politics, victim culture, the abolition of objective truth, the replacement of ideology which replaces truth by power, which has led to an inversion, a reversal of truth and lies, victim and victimizer, and repudiation of reason itself. It is, in short, an onslaught on the West's core values. Now, Richard's book shows how Palestinianism provides a kind of focus for this, but I would suggest this evening that there is a further important factor which we should not minimize, which also helps explain the explosion of anti-Semitism that has convulsed the Western world. In my view, the onslaught against the West, the attempt to remake the West in the image of progressive universalist politics, the brotherhood of man, if you like, which denies resolutely the right of a nation state to operate according to its own traditional culture, and of which the State of Israel is the prime example. This onslaught against the West and its values, I would suggest, was fueled by the Holocaust and the Nazis. Nazi Europe grew up not in some benighted backwater of the world. It emerged in the very centre of Western high culture. The West told itself, we did this, we are responsible for this. Western values and Western culture and modernity were responsible for this, and therefore they have to be reversed and a new world substituted. This was very much the explicit agenda of the revolutionary left, which saw its chance, the demoralization of the West, to put forward what we've all been living through the last half century, an attempt to remake the world in the image of the far left. But of course it wasn't modernity that caused the Holocaust, it was anti-Semitism. And the West cannot admit that fact, because Western culture itself is suffused with Jew hatred, particularly the Christian theological kind, despite the fact that this expressed itself in Nazi paganism. That's another story. And it wasn't just Nazi Europe which was responsible for the Holocaust, but Britain, Europe, and indeed America could be considered to have been accessories to the Holocaust in various things that they did and did not do. Now, I believe that the West cannot cope with this level of guilt. And to escape this guilt, they have come up with a wonderful ruse. They blame the Jews for the Holocaust, and hence this trope of the Israelis as the new Nazis. And I would suggest that demonizing Israel, as we have seen and as Richard explains in his book, furthermore draws upon the most ancient paranoia about the Jews, which is this fear of Jewish power. Western leftist ideology hates power. it thinks power means oppression. It extols instead powerlessness. It champions the powerless who can do no wrong, while the powerful can do no right. Israel, horror of horrors, has military power. It kills people. It doesn't matter to the Western leftist that it is killing people only and exclusively to prevent further murders and deaths amongst its own population. The fact that Israel has military power taps into the paranoid, ancient paranoid dread of Jews as supernaturally powerful. And I believe that the real demonization, the real driver of the demonization of Israel is the demonization of the Jews. And the sentence in Richard's book sprang out of me. Richard writes, "It was mostly about being freed from a sense of obligation to the Jews, a chance to take up again the Jew-baiting so long denied Europeans by a politically correct post-Holocaust sobriety." And to illustrate this point, he quotes a poisonous comment made by the member of the House of Lords and reported in the British Spectator magazine, in which this unnamed peer, apparently of impeccable liberal credentials, said, quote, "Well, the Jews have been asking for it, and now, thank God, we can say what we think at last." Now, I was told something virtually similar to my face around this time, when a prominent liberal journalist and editor said to me, "You've got this anti-Semitism thing completely wrong about Israel. It's not anti-Semitism." And I said, "Well, what is it then?" And he said, "What you have to understand," thank you very much, "what you have to understand is that it's such a relief not to have to worry about the Jews anymore." Now, this was an ambiguous comment, to put it mildly. And I said, "Well, what do you mean you don't have to worry about the Jews anymore?" And he said, "Well, the thing is this, we were told after the Holocaust that we could no longer, it was absolutely unthinkable to criticize Jews under any circumstances. And it's such a relief that now we can." And I said, "What are you telling me? That because now Israelis are being called Nazis, you can be so relieved that it's open season on the Jews once again?" And he said, "I didn't say that." And I said, "That's precisely what you said, and that's precisely what has happened, and that's precisely what Richard has referred to." So, refusing to acknowledge this inversion of reality by the Palestinian Arabs over Israel has led to the whole muddle, to put it as the most charitable, over Islamism, Islamic supremacism, which again Richard goes into considerable detail in his book. This inversion took the form, for example, of President George Bush straight after 9/11, calling Islam a religion of peace at the very moment that the vast majority of the world's Muslims were busy celebrating 9/11 and saying that America had it coming to it. And there's a further very recent example, another personal example of this mad inversion of reality over Islamism. I would just tell you briefly that in the last few weeks, a report was published on a review into Britain's counter-extremism policy called PREVENT. And the long and the short of the review, which is a brilliant review by a man called William Shawcross, it took him a year to get it published by the British Home Office after he finished it, because the British Home Office, the security arm of the British government, tried everything it could to stop it from being published. When it was finally published, the core of his analysis was that an enterprise designed to stop Islamic extremism and radicalization had been basically hijacked by security officials in Britain who concluded that Islamists were not the main problem, it was the far right. Even while the British Security Service was dealing with something like 80% of all terror plots are Islamist, 10% at the moment are far right. The vast majority of people referred to the radicalization strategy organization were far right. And I guessed what was coming. How did they define far right? Well, they defined them as people who supported Brexit and people who supported a variety of socially conservative positions. And I knew what was there, and I found it in a footnote. among the people who the British counter-extremism organisation was telling everybody had to be defended, the country had to be defended against because they posed such a threat to life and limb in Britain, was me. Now, Richard is most savage, pointed and painful in his unsparing analysis of Jewish diaspora attitudes. He shows a direct link between Western self-flagellation and pathological Jewish masochism and self-blame, humiliation, debasement, and thus vulnerability to attack. He talks about the anti-Zionist Jews of the left, including Haaretz columnists Gilad Atzmon, Daniel Boyarin, Avi Schleim, and Pape, who deny the reality of Palestinian Jew hatred. They find it easier to blame their own people, Israel, because that can be addressed, and they have fully adopted the narrative of the enemies of the Jewish people, and some taking refuge in a highly romanticized view of the Jews. Now, Richard wrote his book, obviously, before Mr. Netanyahu returned to power here, but here's what he has written in this book about the reaction of both Israeli and diaspora Jews to the demonization of Israel abroad. Now, just listen to this. He says, Jewish anti-Zionists experience the state of Israel as, quote, a body whose inevitable imperfections, magnified by the news media, humiliate, shame, and disgust them. These openly Jewish figures feel such revulsion at the public revelation of these bodily flaws that every new round of accusations sends them into paroxysms of moral indignation and public self-flagellation. Ring a bell? He quotes to Alvin Rosenfeld in 2006, chronicling the contribution of such Jews to the tsunami of global anti-Semitism, as they call Israel, quote, Nazis, racists, genocidal, insane, demonic, and fanatical. Ring a bell? I think that's exactly what we are seeing and hearing today about curbing the so-called anti-democratic power grab by curbing the anti-democratic power grab by the Israeli judiciary being proposed by the Netanyahu government. Diaspora Jews, writes Landis, who are constantly under pressure from Gentile colleagues and friends and less likely to grasp the absurdity of the claims being made about Israel, have more readily fallen in with the liberal damnation of Israel. And he says that they say to themselves, how much easier to lament Israel's tragic drift to the right. Ring a bell? I think, he says, these anti-Zionist radicals have also, they're not just on the fringe, they're not just the hard left, they have redefined the terrain for the liberal mainstream in diaspora Jewry, which he terms verbal vegetarians. It was fine. It was somebody else, I beg your pardon, but he has used it. He writes, if you defend Israel, you get labelled right-wing, and even Israel's sympathizers aren't willing to risk their credentials as good people by speaking out on Israel's behalf, or worse, actively criticizing the progressives leading the charge of lemmings over the cliff. Well, I can tell you in Britain, the Jewish community leadership is entirely silent about Muslim Jew hatred around the world and in Britain. It's entirely silent about Palestinian Nazism. It damns anybody who dares to say that the Jews alone are entitled to the land, the whole land of Israel and the territories. It damns them as fascist extremists. And it attacks all who speak about this as Islamophobes and racists. And that's how the Jewish leadership in Britain describes it. The demonization of Israel, and finally, ladies and gentlemen, I believe the demonization of Israel has to be set in the context of the West's self-destructive demoralization in every sense. How can we defend ourselves as Jews? Well, Jews need to pull themselves back from going over the edge of the same cultural cliff. I would suggest that reading Richard's magnificent book would be a very good start. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for asking me to speak. speak in this occasion must first of all say that I know Richard for more than 20 years now. And, he was my teacher on some of these issues of understanding the delegitimization of Israel, understanding Islamism and its commitment to change the world order, and the way these trends make use of the mainstream media and the weakness and the similitudes of the West in general and some parts of the Jewish people as well, unfortunately. And I think that what we have in front of us in this book is Richard putting all that he has in his heart, everything that he was so committed to in the last 20-something years, to share it with us. And this is so important because Richard, in a way, it was already mentioned here, is the epistemological authority on these issues. We use terms that he invented in order to express ourselves. He's the Eliezer ben Yehuda of the delegitimization. It's amazing. We all use Pallywood and other words that are coming into mind in this respect. Like lethal journalism, you know.
That was your term.
Did I invent that? I was attributed that to you. But okay, maybe I did. Anyhow, what's amazing about this book is that this is a book that keeps being written after you finish it and you publish it, it's keeping being written by itself. I mean, take for example two things that happened after the book was already finished. One of them is really amazing. Secretary Blinken on the 31st of January, standing next to Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. And Abu Mazen starts the joint press conference by saying, "Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Israel is terrible, Israel is totally unacceptable, Israel is killing us, killing children, Israel is apartheid." So you would expect the Secretary of State of our best ally and friend to say, when his time comes, "Sorry, Mr. President," if you want to call him like that, but Israel is not an apartheid state, and Israel, if it kills Palestinians, it does it because it is involved in self-defense operations that we fully support. Instead, no mentioning of the libel of apartheid, not a word about it, and condolences for the Palestinians and Israelis who are suffering from violence and terror. No, not terror, violence, suffering of violence. Is there a bigger similitude? Why not tell the truth? Because some sort of low expectation patriotism? Because of real fear that who knows what's going to happen if I say the truth in front of this anti-Semite? And he's just walking in the same line that Chancellor Scholz showed him when Abu Mazen was standing next to him and speaking about the 50 Holocausts that Israel has performed against the Palestinians, and he didn't find anything to say about that. So this book is still being written every day, again and again. Now in his book, and by the way, it's also true when we speak about Iran. everybody's really concerned with the drones supplied by Iran to the Russians to be used in the war in Ukraine. But nobody cares about the caricature, the anti-Semitic caricature contest that the Iranians are holding every year. That's of course acceptable. Now, Richard focuses on certain elements of this war that's being waged, this cognitive war. And especially his expertise is what's going on with in the media, the mainstream media. And we had the opportunity to cooperate in fighting this phenomenon when I was head of the committee that looked at the Mohammed Dura case for the government back in 2012, 2013. Okay, you know better. And we had to say really harsh criticism about the way Charles Anderlan and France 2 treated the information they got. And we didn't come to any conclusion, we couldn't come to a conclusion whether Mohammed Dura was killed this way or that way, or whether he was killed at all. We couldn't find the answer to that, but we were very easily able to say the way that press, in this respect, France 2, used or referred to the information was not adequate according to the ethics of journalism. But clearly, nobody cares about this ethics. Because journalism for anybody who's interested in that, journalism is dead. There's no such thing as journalism anymore. It's just a tool to express your views under the guise of journalism. Unfortunately, this is true not only to one side of the journalism, it's true for many sides of the journalism. It's very difficult to find a journalist these days. So this is a disease of journalism in general, not only in the context of our topic here. But the fight in the mainstream media about delegitimization of Israel and the treatment of what used to be Western values is much bigger than that. This fight is being waged in diplomacy, in the education system, in the campuses around the West. It's waged in trade unions, it's waged in economical aspects, the BDS and so on and so forth. And it's all part of something much bigger that people just don't want to believe in. And this is that the Palestinians and some others are committed to an effort to change the situation in such a radical way that Israel will not exist anymore. They have a very clear narrative supporting this idea. It says, first of all, that the Jews are not people, they're just a religion, and as such they don't have the right of self-determination. And secondly, that the Jews are terrible creatures, and that's why the West didn't want them. It's coming back to what Melanie said earlier. The West wanted to get rid of them, and therefore what we need to do is to struggle against them with a variety of ways. So back in the days, until 74, actually until 71, the Palestinians thought that the only way to achieve their goal is through armed struggle. But since 74, they have come to the conclusion that, by the way, they learned from the Vietnamese that the best way to handle this problem is to reach out to the American liberal Jews. You have to convince them to be on your side. And the delegation of high-ranking Palestinians, including Arafat and Abu Yal, that learned about that back in the time, said, that's a great idea. That's how they eventually reached the stages theory in 1974. And ever since then, they said, not only armed struggle. Cognitive warfare is even more important than the armed struggle. Armed struggle is supporting the cognitive battle, not vice versa. And if we win the cognitive battle, then we should be able to wipe Israel off the map. And in order to be able to win the cognitive battle, we have a very clear target audience. The liberal left. We have to put them on our side. And we have to have a strategy to make this happen. And the strategy is what we call the Red-Green Alliance. Joining hands between radical Muslims and extreme left in an attempt to gain more and more ground inside the liberal left. And then I think about Richard's book, is that he says right in the beginning, this is where the battle is being fought. It's within the liberal left. And my book is for you liberal leftists. If you're not a liberal leftist, don't read my book. And I think this is extremely important because this is where we are fighting about the needle. We're trying to move the needle in this direction, and they are trying to move the needle in that direction. And unfortunately, I must say that because of the division of labor amongst Israelis and Jews in general, it's becoming very difficult to hold the needle for moving, let alone moving it in the opposite direction. And the idea of intersectionality plays well into the hands of those who are opposing Israel. We saw that long time ago when Judge Jones, I forgot his name, Judge Goldstone. When Judge Goldstone in his report was ready to believe that Israel Defense Forces intentionally hit the grain silos and the sewage facilities in Gaza in order to make the life of the Palestinians terrible and starve them. This was the point where Israelis realized that something is wrong here. It was the first time after 10 years that we totally evacuated the battlefield. For 10 years, since Oslo until 2001, until Durban, we were not in the game. We thought, peace is here. We can go home. Everything is all right. We totally didn't understand that nothing has changed in this Palestinian narrative that justifies the struggle. In many ways, not only in one way. And when the second Intifada erupted, we again thought that the best thing to do is to fight the terror. Not the ideas that lie behind the terror, but the terror itself. And we were very happy after Defensive Shield that we were able to eventually force the Palestinians to give up the sword, the suicide bombings. We thought, well, we must have won the war. We won nothing. Because this idea that in a cognitive warfare, you can ask Zelensky, he will tell you something. In a cognitive warfare, the most important thing is to be able to gain two elements. One is to put yourself in the place of the collective victim. And secondly, to be able to say that you are ready to sacrifice everything in order to change it. You are powerful enough. And this is a story about Palestinian terrorism, on the one hand, and the Palestinian internalization of the situation of refugees, that we in the West helped them gain through our assistance. Look at Blinken at the same press conference, proud of giving $50 million more to the UNRWA. eternalizing the conflict, not even demanding that they will stop teaching hatred and denial of the right of Israel to exist. The Palestinians managed to take these two positions, and we said to ourselves, we are not victims. We were victims in the past, but we are not victims anymore. We don't want to be there. But it's very difficult to fight a war, cognitive war in the West if you're not a victim. Especially if you try to apply to liberal leftists, who, as Melanie explained so well, see the fact that you're powerful as something that you should be blamed for. This is a very difficult situation. It calls, and Richard said that he believes that we can win. Well, that's nice to say. We always should say so. But winning doesn't come just because you believe that you're going to win. You gotta have a strategy, you gotta have the tools, you gotta have the coordination necessary between the different forces fighting. And God knows how difficult it is to convince several groups of Jews to work together. It's close to impossible. And Iran sitting here is one of the people, many people, who are trying to make it happen. And I know how all of us that are so committed to winning this battle understand how difficult it is. So we have to cut a little bit on our egos, and we have to bring our ability to be smart into this game. We have to outsmart our enemies, and we have to understand that in order to win a war, and this is a war, you have to be very capable in learning, because war is a competition of learning. We are doing some good stuff. We here and there are able to say, here's the wrong thing about what these guys are doing, and look them bad, make them look bad. We are doing that from time to time. But we have to spend more time in learning the terrain and understanding it. And I think in this respect, Richard's book is making a very important contribution, not only to liberal leftists, but also to everybody who wants to have an impact on this war. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Now, in the past, it could be argued that nobles and aristocrats practiced a kind of identity politics of superiority. We were born better than you, they would say. But today, Jonah Goldberg argued in his book Suicide of the West, we live in a culture with an identity politics that makes victims into heroes. We were discriminated against more than you. This leads to a culture where minorities, or at least those defined as minorities, are not just granted sympathy and honor, but are gifted extra legitimacy to their ideas and arguments. An aristocracy of victimhood, if you will. Whereas liberal universalism sought to diminish the significance of identity categories, those mere accidents of birth, and treat people equally, this new hierarchy of victimology valorizes not the dignity of individuals as individuals, but their dignity insofar as their assigned oppressed group identity. The Greek saying, character is destiny, gets turned on its head, and posited instead is the idea that your group identity is your destiny. Further, if your identity is wrapped up in the idea that you're persecuted, the form of your identity becomes psychologically synonymous with whoever or whatever you think drives the persecution. This can have all sorts of unhealthy consequences. You can start seeing evidence of your persecution where it doesn't exist because you need that evidence to sustain your sense of identity. You look for reasons to be offended. Obviously, this is most acute and relevant for forms of identity like race, gender, sexual identity, and religion. But this dynamic is not reserved solely for such things. The increasing popularity within intellectual academic circles of this Manichaean paradigm, dividing humanity into a morally pristine class of minority saints versus a group of oppressor fiends has led to the mainstream media imputing such a moral binary to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, positing a theory of justice based narrowly on which group has power and which group doesn't. Now, within this framing, where race and power mediate all human relations and thus adjudicates all claims to victimhood, Israelis will inevitably, regardless of the facts, be assigned the role of oppressor. Now, this doesn't merely demonize Jewish Israelis. It also promotes an extremely self-defeating fatalism that denies agency to Palestinians. The irony is that pro-Palestine activists and their media supporters sometimes claim that all they desire, the only thing they're really looking for, is for Palestinians to be humanized, while simultaneously infantilizing those same Palestinians, imagining that the normal laws of causation, what commentator Rob Henderson describes as the reliable connections between good choices and good outcomes and bad choices and bad outcomes, don't apply to their situation. Now, examples of the media promotion of this paradigm abound. Here are some specific examples. On the day recently when a Palestinian terrorist rammed his car into a group of Jewish pedestrians, killing 3, including 2 young boys, aged 8 and 6, Sky News website headline told readers that a car drives into a crowd at a bus stop, evoking malevolent autonomous vehicle. And this is part of a larger pattern of denying Palestinian agency by erasing the Palestinian extremists from the equation. During the COVID crisis, you might remember, Israel was blamed for shortages of vaccines in the PA, despite the fact that under Oslo, the PA is responsible for their own health care. Indeed, over the years, the media, and particularly The Guardian, has blamed Israel for Palestinian social problems such as high rates of domestic violence, and even blamed Israel in one article for increased miscarriages within the Palestinian territories. Here are some more general examples. When media outlets suggest without evidence that Palestinian terrorism is motivated by a frustration with the stalled peace process, they omit the crucial historical background that the Second Intifada erupted a mere 2 months after Yasser Arafat rejected Ehud Barak's peace proposal, and continued even after Barak offered the PA leader an even more generous offer, which they again turned down. The timeline just doesn't work. Another broader example. Media outlets will often call Israelis extremists, sometimes fairly, but usually not. Yet Palestinians are almost never ascribed such a pejorative ideological labels. In fact, Palestinians' ideologies are a mystery to journalists, it seems. This dynamic has also bled into coverage of jihadist attacks in the US, Europe, and throughout the world. Now, the 9/11 attacks made a huge impression on me for many reasons, one of which was how often in the aftermath of the attacks, people would say to me something along the lines of, we really need to ask ourselves what we keep doing to make these people so angry at us. Now, this isn't merely blaming the victim. I think it's another manifestation of the cult of victimhood, the increasing tendency of journalists, activists, academics, and intellectuals to deny agency to those whom, within this ideology, are bestowed the title of oppressed groups, an honor which perversely is not granted to Jews. One specific example comes to mind. If you recall, in the aftermath of the deadly 2012 Islamist attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, it was erroneously framed in the beginning by most mainstream media outlets as a spontaneous protest over the anti-Islamic film Innocence of the Muslims, which was falsely described in The Guardian and elsewhere as having been made by an Israeli Jew with funding from 100 Jewish donors. Again, as with coverage of Palestinian attacks on Israelis, the media immediately found credible a narrative which erroneously blamed the West broadly, and an Israeli Jew and Jewish donors in particular, for the deadly actions of Muslim extremists. Media outlets later only begrudgingly walked back those charges when it was demonstrated that the filmmaker was an Egyptian Christian, and that the film had no role whatsoever in the premeditated Islamist terror attack. But the outrage isn't merely the gross and anti-Semitic disinformation. It's the fact that even if the original narrative was true, how would it in any way be justifiable for Islamists to attack the U.S. Embassy as the result of being insulted by a film? Here's a thought experiment. Imagine if there were some international Zionist terrorists plotting attacks against enemy targets or enemies. And just suppose that these radical Zionists launched a deadly attack on some foreign embassy following the release of an anti-Semitic film produced by a Muslim. Is it even fathomable that the media would frame the attack as the fault of the film's Muslim creator? The question, of course, answers itself. All right, so more than just complaining about the problem, let's think about how we respond to such lethal journalism. The tendency of media outlets, in the name of progressivism and in the name of afflicting the comfortable while comforting the afflicted, to manipulate news coverage in a way which threatens Jews and emboldens the very aggressive forces at Western values more broadly. Well, of course, aggressively challenging the media lies, distortions, and moral double standards, as Camera often does, is of course extremely important. However, I think there's a broader fight that's worth engaging in, the battle of ideas. To save and promote classical liberal values, the ideas which were revolutionary in their day, which were ushered into the West by people like Locke, Mill, Montesquieu, Madison, and Hamilton, but which are sadly increasingly under attack by both the left and the right. A few ideas that I think are worth remembering, how we got here. The veneration and codification of individual as opposed to group rights, which are protected via the neutral application of laws. The idea that we should judge each person not by their station or their family heritage, or by their victim status, but by their decisions, actions, and achievements, that is, agency. Human agency over fatalism. The sacredness of the individual over the group. The lethal journalism that we're fighting is animated by a sort of utopianism, a politics that demands allegiance to a totalizing politics, what the economist and writer Thomas Sowell calls the quest for cosmic justice, which by its nature rejects the tolerance, pluralism, and compromises which life in the liberal democratic West demands. Let's resist the temptation to fight that totalizing illiberal agenda with another illiberal agenda. Instead, let's defend and promote without apologies the values of liberal democracy, the political system and habits of mind which don't strive for permanent solutions or perfect justice, but which merely serve as a hedge against tyranny and represents a way to settle differences without resorting to the sword. I think that's good enough. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of our wonderful speakers. Because of time, what I think I'll do is I'm going to firstly just see if four people have already shot their hands up with an emergency. So we'll just hold for a minute. I'm going to just see if any of our panelists would like to respond to anything they heard from their fellow panelists. Richard, is there anything you'd like to, as the real guest of honor, is there anything you'd like to say?
Not only is Manfred Gerstenfeld, Zichrono Livracha, responsible for verbal vegetarian, he's also responsible for the term which permeated your talk, humanitarian racism. I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, just 1 second. I'll make sure that we have a microphone that can... Was it, Lily, is the camera pointing in the right direction? Okay. All right, so we will take some questions. There's the gentleman here near the front with his hand up. Just wait for the mic to reach you, okay? So I can hear your questions. Okay, but I want to make sure that our recording picks it up as well. So just hold on for 10 seconds, okay? Thanks, Lily.
The question is for Yossi Kupperwasser. How can it be that back in 2003 or so, when Richard and I were still living in Boston, that's more or less when we met, you said he was your teacher about many of these issues. Many of the issues happening here. You grew up here, you were living here. How could it be that he, an American, had to teach you an Israeli about the issues that affected this country?
Well, let me tell you something. Israelis that were born in Israel are much less aware of this issue. I'm not going to make a poll here in the room, but I have the feeling that more Olim Chadashim are present here than in the general public.
I think that's a fair assessment.
And I must say say that I found myself many times as or the only one or one of a very small group of people within a much bigger group of Olim Chadashim, newcomers, when we were tackling that. The reason I became aware of that was that when I was Chief Intelligence Officer of Central Command at the beginning of the Second Intifada, I saw what's happening. And I said to myself immediately, we have to do something different in order to face the way these people lie so fast. It takes us so long in order to respond. And I suggested to build a command center for countering Palestinian lies. Okay? מרכז פיקודי להסברה ולתקשורת, that's how we call it.
But this was nothing new. This has been going on since...
Yeah, it was nothing new, it was nothing new, but for the Central Command it was totally new, okay? And for Central Command, I tell you, after 1993, Central Command was convinced that peace has arrived. It's definitely no need for collective. You know, I was heading the cooperation with the Palestinian forces at the time. And we had meetings once a week or something like that, discussing all kinds of matters that had to do with running the life in the areas of the Central Command, the areas of the Palestinians. And after each meeting, they would report in the press, and the meetings were reasonable. And after each meeting, they would report to the West that they have met the representatives of the occupation army. I was telling them, what kind of occupation did I represent when we were meeting? But for them, it was the occupation army. I said, listen, this is wrong. We have to do something about that. And when the war broke, the Second Intifada broke, we were not able to face because Israelis didn't anticipate something like that. It's even today. You know, I tell you, when I was Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and we started after the Goldstone report to get ourselves better prepared to face these allegations. We had a big meeting in King David, and there was people from all the organizations that fight for Israel's legitimacy and against anti-Semitism. There was a young representative of Mujas, and she said, you have to understand this was 2010. Okay?
לא שומעים.
This was 2010.
No,
And she said, you know, for us on campus, it's very dangerous, and don't use the word Zionist. It's too dangerous to say that you're a Zionist. And all Israelis in the crowd, they looked at her as, what? You don't use Zionists? We are Zionists, not a problem, we are Zionists. And it came as a big surprise for the Israelis in the room. There's a big difference between where we sit and where the others. Unfortunately, we don't understand what we should have understood long ago, that this is a strategic threat for the state of Israel. Many of us still don't, yes. That's something that I hope eventually will come to the attention of people. Look, Erdan was responsible for that, Steinitz was responsible for that, today Shikli is responsible for that. More and more people that are not coming from the diaspora are responsible for that. I hope eventually it will trickle into the minds of more and more Israelis that are born here.
Yeah, if I could add... Hello? Yeah. If I can add just one point to that. I think that, the State of Israel was founded, among other things, on the proposition that it would put an end to anti-Semitism. Right? And I think a lot of Israelis grew up thinking that they were living in an atmosphere where they didn't run into anti-Semitism. Some of us who grew up, for instance, in liberal academic communities in America also grew up without much anti-Semitism. But I think that the ability of Palestinian lethal narratives to seize hold of the imagination of Westerners was something that Israelis couldn't understand. They couldn't fathom why people would go for these things. Why, when, you got this crappy footage of a boy being shot at, and it turns out the bullets aren't even coming from the Israeli side, and you're told that the Israelis killed him in cold blood. Most Israelis think, how on earth could anybody believe that? Well, yeah.
Okay. Yes, the lady with the white sweater. Just a second. Wait for the mic. Maybe pass it down.
Hello. I've got a question for Melanie Phillips. And so anyone else who's English, but especially for her.
Can you hold the mic closer?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My question is for Melanie. Do you consider that the anti-Israel rhetoric in the British press and British social media and everything has got worse? If so, what can we do about it?
Small question.
That's a very small question. Yes, it has got worse because it's got more brazen. But I came up against it very late in the year 2000. That's not true. I came up against it in 1982 when I was working for The Guardian. The Guardian basically made me what I am today. I've learned everything that I know from The Guardian. It was pretty bad then, but it tended to get worse whenever Israel had a military operation in Gaza, and then it kind of died down again. And the phenomenon of the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years maybe a bit longer, is that it's now at a constantly very high level, and it's accompanied by gross and overt anti-Semitism, which is of epidemic levels, and not just in Britain, but around the West. So what can be done? Well, the short answer is anti-Semitism is by definition deranged and irrational, and you cannot fight something like that and get rid of it. Anti-Semitism has always been with us and it always will be with us. The most we can expect is to put it back under its stone, and a properly functioning civilized society will have it under its stone. Now, as I suggested in my remarks, I think that anti-Semitism is part of a broader phenomenon in the West, which has basically lost its collective mind, as we can see from the whole identity politics thing of race and gender and all the rest of it. Being told, that we all have to basically do penance for the fact that we're white people, and the West was born in original sin, and America was born in original sin. This is all ahistorical, ignorant nonsense. And I think we're living through an eclipse of reason in what is supposed to be the age of reason. So clearly, we as Jews, there's only a very limited amount that we could ever do in the face of such a cultural onslaught. And I think also that if the West decides to pull back from the cultural cliff, if it gets its own act together, then quite a lot of this stuff will go away as far as Jews are concerned. What can we do in the meantime? A lot. I can only speak for Britain as in terms of the diaspora. I can't speak for America and I can't speak for Europe. But what I'm absolutely certain of is that while in Britain it has for sure a long and inglorious history of embedded anti-Semitism in its culture. I would suggest that the vast majority of British people who subscribe to the narrative of the left about Israel, the demonization of Israel, do so out of a profound ignorance of both Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish people. Unfortunately, that ignorance extends also to the Jewish community in Britain, which is increasingly, appallingly educated or uneducated, and which does not wish to identify itself as part of the Jewish nation. Judaism, for many of them, is something that at best is a kind of add-on. But basically, if it gets too inconvenient, it can be disposed of. Now, what the Jewish community needs to do, and I think it would have a transformative effect, would be to pick its head up from the floor, or up from below the parapet where it is, and pick its knees up collectively from the floor where they are, and start telling some truths which British people have never heard from the Jewish community. For example, as I said in my remarks, the fact that Muslim anti-Semitism is a major driver of the anti-Semitism that's going on in Britain at present. The fact that all those leftists who support Palestinian rights, and many people, have an image of the poor, dispossessed Palestinians and so on. If the Jewish community were to get up and say, look, people, it's only the Jews for whom this was ever their national kingdom, and these people you are supporting are culturally appropriating our history and stealing it for themselves and depriving us of it. If they were to start producing what can be accessed by anybody online, Palestinian Media Watch, the work of memory in translating, forget the Hamas, what the Palestinian Authority is delivering to its children and its people, which is basically Nazi tropes of not just Israel hatred, not just teaching everybody, its children, to grow up to murder Jews and steal their land, murder Israelis and steal their land, but teaching them to hate Jews as Jews with demonic Nazi-style images. The Jewish community in Britain never says any of that. Now, if they were to start saying these and other similar things, I can absolutely guarantee the situation would change overnight, because it would force itself into the public domain. Now, I've had these conversations with Israelis over the last N years, not Yossi, and I have said this to them. I've said, why don't you bring these truths out? Why do we never hear it at a high level? And the answer is always, first of all, don't tell us what to do. You do nothing. Okay. Secondly, what, you think that we are going to ever convince what the British, after what they did to us here in Palestine, you think we're ever going to convince the Europeans what the graveyard of our people? And I say to them, yes, you would change the atmosphere overnight in Britain. I can't speak for Europe. Don't tell us about Britain. You know nothing. This is the Israeli, I'm afraid, attitude. And why do they think that? Partly it's ignorance, partly it's arrogance, and partly it's because they have, it's just like, with the Al-Jura affair and other things. Let's park that. We've got many other things to worry about. Iran, the Islamic Jihad, the rockets from Gaza. Understandable. We can't be doing with getting to the truth of every one of these allegations. It's not worth it. They don't understand the importance of the cognitive war and how important it is to fight it. They never have, and they don't. And so if the Jewish world were to start saying these things, I believe that is a very powerful way in which we could indeed fight back very effectively.
Wait for the mic to make its way back. Okay, so a gentleman at the back there with a sort of reddish burgundy sweater that I can make out.
Thank you. A number of prominent conservative thinkers have pointed out that conservative political movements are handicapped in a way that progressive movements are not. The progressives offer a vision for where they're going, whereas the conservatives basically say, oh, we want the status quo, we want things to stay where they are. And when we talk about the media war, I'm concerned that we're in a kind of similar reactive position, that we're constantly saying, no, that's not true, no, this is really the truth over here, and no, you've got us wrong, but we don't have a strong vision for where we do want to go. We could say peace, 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 but the other side is also saying that. So I'd like to know, Richard and maybe some of the other panelists, what's your positive vision for where we could go?
Okay, who would like to? I want to hear from Adam something, because I think Adam has a chance to respond to something, but maybe
When you're on the defensive, I guess you're handicapped in a way, right? Because you're forced to react. Look, it's interesting that you mentioned conservative versus progressives, because I think the question that conservatives don't often get answered, and this will relate to your question, is what is it that they're trying to conserve? Right? Within the American context, I think small c conservatives are trying to conserve the principles of the founding, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the codification of natural laws that are inalienable. So moving that to the Israeli sphere, the Israelis are trying to conserve Zionism, right? They're trying to be a free people in their land. It's the same message that they enunciated during the Declaration of Independence in 1948. The problem is, we're at this rhetorical disadvantage because, as I tried to outline in my talk, we've committed the worst sin possible within modern progressive discourse. That is, we won. We were successful. We're financially successful, Israelis. We're militarily and diplomatically successful, despite all of our problems. So how do you fight back within a paradigm that immediately assumes that the weaker party is the more righteous party? And I think that very often we're too hard on ourselves, going insofar as, I don't know that we can win that fight. I think the only way to even begin to push back at that is to accept that this is a long war. There's a journal called the Long War Journal, and everyone's always looking for a quick fix, right? A magic bullet for fixing the problem. And and I think that there's also a movement within the U.S. of the Israeli Victory Coalition, I think it's called, that that why don't we aim for victory? Well, I think we can win by not losing, and it might not be exciting, it might not galvanize the crowd, but I think that we need to set our sights at a realistic level. And I think we're still here, the country's still here, we're actually doing quite well despite all the problems, despite all the attacks on our legitimacy. So I think we need to look at this as a long fight, one which we can, like I said, win by not losing.
Let me divide your question into two different parts. The first part is, you're absolutely right that we have a lot of trouble because we're constantly playing the defensive. And it's not just that we constantly play the defensive, but one of the things that I noticed is, if Israel, the Hezbollah crowd, manages to blunt an accusation, they're satisfied with that. Hey, we won. We stopped them from thinking that we did X, Y, or Z. And there's no counterattack. And I think that we should be taking the attack. I think we should be seizing on various things. I'll give you one example. Shirin Abu Akleh. I don't know, and I've asked Yossi, and I've asked lots of people, and I don't get good answers, why Israel said that they think they killed, that Israeli troops killed her, but what they don't understand is that the accusation went out immediately and was picked up by the media that she was killed deliberately, that she was targeted, just like Muhammad Abdullah. And that's the key thing. The key thing is the accusation of malevolence. And the accusation came from two people, one of whom appears in my Hollywood movie, initially in Pierre Rechaud's movie about Jenin, in which he's organizing a fake story. And the guy's been doing it ever since. And yet, all of a sudden, he appears 20 years later as a reliable witness to an accusation. So we don't do that. We don't go after the unreliability of Palestinian witnesses. We don't do the kind of counterattacks, and even maybe launch some of our own, for instance, an attack on Palestinian incitement, genocidal incitement, and so on, that we should do. But the second part of your question was about, the vision that we have of a society. And I actually, at the beginning of the book, I lay out the difference between, I'm not sure how I label it, demotic values on the one hand and domineering values on the other, zero-sum versus positive-sum. I think there's a great deal in the sort of messy but happy world of civil society that is well worth fighting for. You know, when you look at Israel and you look at the incredible amount of activity that occurs and the learning that occurs and goes on permanently, I mean, in a funny way, Israel's one of the greatest places to retire to, because it's just so full of life and the appreciation of nature and all of the things that give Israel life taste in Israel. I think that's something actually quite glorious. And then on the other hand, you can go after these flaky, loopy millennial dreams on the left about eradicating power and eradicating every aggression down to the microist, even as they allow the Palestinians to engage in vicious macroaggression. So I do think that a lot, Melanie wrote a book actually, reputed, called The World Turned Upside Down. You know, the world has been flipped. We are radically, cognitively and empirically and morally disoriented. And I think it's possible to flip it back.
First of all, on the political side, Israel is so divided that it's difficult to come and say what is that we want. Every Israeli wants something else. So it's difficult to say, but you know, revealed preference can tell you what we really want. And it's, taking what Richard said, we make a lot of children. That's what we do. I think this is the answer. We get stronger by that.
Sure.
I just want to very quickly have my 2 pennies in answer to that last question. What is the vision? I think the vision should be, the Jewish vision should be set out as a fight for truth and justice and law, and to say that the Jews and the state of Israel are on the side of all these things, and we stand against, in the great fight against tyranny and fascism and despotism, and we invite the world to join us.
Once, and I'm going to give my panelists the choice of which they wish to answer. Please make the question short and a very definitive question.
This is a question for the whole panel. Is Israel avoiding the fight? I'm specifically asking the way Israel is avoiding dealing with the International Criminal Court. Instead of fighting in world bodies like the Criminal Court, we do everything we can not to enter them.
Okay, thank you. Lily, can you bring the mic down here? Okay, so that's the question about the criminal court and other world bodies that Israel is, as the questioner says, abrogating in some way and not avoiding.
Thank you, panel. The question was that the book, can the whole world be against us? And I wonder if you could ask, can Israel be against Israel itself? From the point of view that when the story of Adura emerged, the head of Central or Southern Command, the Yomtov Samia, has specifically said that it's not possible, according to ballistic analysis, that it would have been shot by Israeli, but the government here sidelined him and took the position that Israel killed the boy. And why could it be possibly, could it be that they want to find favor in the eyes of the world? But have we learned from it? No, because when it comes to the story of Abu Akleh, there is evidence that the bullet that was used was sledgehammered and the wrong size, the wrong way. Could it be that we're trying to find, why we try to find favor in the eyes of the nations?
Okay, so two actual quite related questions. Is Israel not doing enough in world bodies and is avoiding the issue by not getting involved in the discussions in world bodies like the criminal court? And is Israel actually harming itself by not accepting the evidence in examples like the Al-Dura? Okay, so Richard, choose which one you would just answer one.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to the Adula thing, because it wasn't just that the government spokesman said, well, maybe we killed her, which immediately was read as they did it on purpose. But I had a conversation here in Jerusalem with a number of Israeli journalists, well known. One of whom I'm going to mention by name because he called me, Bet Michaeli. I said, what do you think of the Adula story? This is 2003. And he said, 100% Yisraelim hargu oto. So what you're dealing with Israeli journalists who are vigorously putting their back into supporting Palestinian legal narratives. And it was after the Yom Tov Samia had done his investigation, which was ridiculed by people at Haaretz and stuff. When you're dealing with that kind of a situation, it's very hard. Gerald is here somewhere, wrote a piece on Jew washing. The degree to which people who hate Israel use hyper self-critical Jews, including hyper self-critical Israelis, is staggering. And, well,
So to answer the second question more generally, in Ehud Barak, at some point after the failed negotiations in 2000-2001, was recalling a conversation, negotiations, where Yasser Arafat rejected that there ever was a second temple in Jerusalem. And he said something that always struck me. He said that, he experienced no cognitive dissonance when he said that. And we're fighting at a disadvantage because we experience and respond to the normal cognitive dissonance that you experience when you're saying something that's contradictory, that contradicts a previous belief or something you said before. That is, we're kind of wedded and proudly to Western notions of truth, of fact, integrity, and reason. So no, we're not going to go fly off a handle and claim that we know, as a matter of fact, that Shireen Abu Akleh was killed as a result of a Palestinian bullet when we're not sure. Now, we can be as critical as we want to be about how we handled Al-Dura or Shireen Abu Akleh, but we're going to be at a disadvantage almost for a good reason, because we do care about the truth, because we do care about not saying things that are contradictory or saying things just because they sound good. In other words, to the degree that we accept Western values, that we're always going to be at a disadvantage. And I think, I'm not saying we should, that's a good, I mean, that the result is good, but I wouldn't want to live in a country that didn't accept those values.
Yeah, well, I would say that accepting the values that Adam was speaking about is very important, that we stick to the truth, and that's why we are late in saying and responding to other things, because we want to check, and so on and so forth. But sticking to the truth is not an excuse for being unprofessional and being totally irrelevant. When you choose your words, you have to be careful about what do they mean. And you have to stick to the truth, but yet say, in our mind, which they don't know, but it looks as if, or most probable case was that he was killed by, if he was killed at all, he was killed by something else, and whatever, if this is the case, and so on and so forth. What happened with Al-Dura was that somebody from the military immediately came out and said, we killed him, and now go fight the battle. See, you're totally lost. Because most people believe that if somebody says something, especially because we stick to the truth, he probably knows what he's talking about. And we are, after all, we have these weapons that can hit everything precisely, and we never make any mistakes. So if somebody gets killed out of in any occasion, we are involved. We must have killed him deliberately. We don't miss. We never miss. We never make mistakes. So that's something that has to be done sophisticatedly enough. And, we lack this sophistication most of the time. This is a pity. Coming back to the issue of the ICC, I think we shouldn't give any legitimacy to these groups that try to hound us and bring us to courts and so on and so forth. The ICC doesn't have the legitimacy, the authority to investigate IDF soldiers, and we shouldn't give it legitimacy to do so. And that's why we behave the way we behave, and I think we're doing the right thing.
Last word, please.
On the question of is Israel against itself, I think, if I heard you correctly, that you were referring to specific evidence given by the ballistics expert, Nahum Shachaf, I think is his name, which was suppressed and denied in both the Al-Dura case and in the Abu Akhle case. I read that evidence by... What?
You wrote in that...
Oh, I wrote about it. Yes, I did. That's quite right. I forget what I wrote yesterday. And it struck me as astonishing, because here is a guy, he's a ballistic expert, this is what he does, he looks at, the trajectory of bullets and blah, blah, and he saw this bullet had been not just damaged, but destroyed. And he said it could only have been destroyed to that extent by something like a hammer. Now, that evidence just vanished. And so I was left wondering, well, is there something wrong with this guy? Is he a lunatic? What do the Israelis think about it? And then I thought back to Al-Dura, when I spoke about the Al-Dura affair with him. And he told me that he had taken his evidence to the Israelis, I don't know what level, and they didn't want to know. They wanted it to go away. Because that's what they do. They want these things to go away because they got other bigger fish to fry. And they don't, I'll come back to the one we will be making. They don't understand, they don't want to understand the importance of winning the battle for hearts and minds. And this relates also to the ICC. I don't disagree at all with what Yossi has said. Don't give it legitimacy. But then, if you're not going to give it legitimacy, then you have to do something, again, it relates to everything else we've been talking about. You shouldn't wait for the ICC to pronounce or to start its investigation. You shouldn't wait for the fatal incident in Jenin or wherever it is, and then say, it wasn't us, it wasn't our bullet, it was done in good faith, we're not apartheid, we're not oppressing the Palestinians. That's all playing defense. Once you start playing defense on territory mapped out by the enemy, you have lost. It doesn't matter what you produce. So the whole strategy is wrong. Israel has to go onto the offense. It shouldn't be sitting around biting its nails, waiting to know whether the ICC is going to do this or that. No! Week in, week out, it should be telling the world why the ICC is an utterly corrupted institution with no validity, jurisdictional validity, moral validity. It's opinions on this, it's opinions on that. It's a politicized court. Take the judges apart. On and on and on. Delegitimize it. This is the tactics that's done to Israel. Delegitimizing Israel all the time. And the tactics of the enemy, which is doing this to us, is to use lies from start to finish. But we need to take a leaf out of their book and delegitimize them with truth, because they need to be delegitimized. Most ordinary, decent people in the West have no idea about what a rotten, corrupt organization the ICC is, because it is fundamentally corrupted, because it has no jurisdictions, therefore innately political. People have no idea about this. They have no idea about the lies that come out of Hollywood the whole time. Why don't they know? Because the Israelis choose never to say it. Okay, you can point at individual politicians, journalists, cultural figures, NGOs in Israel saying it. But no one pays them a blind bit of attention. It has to be a national strategy delivered at a very high level with a great deal of expertise in this kind of work to make people report it, to make the media report it. You can do it if you calibrate it correctly and judge it correctly. So I won't have this about, it's all very difficult and we have to wait and we have to do this, we have to be sure. No! The strategy is wrong. Get off the back foot onto the front.
Call to action, a great way to end a fantastic evening. I said at the beginning we had a fantastic panel. They did not disappoint. Thank you so much to Richard Landis and Adam Levick. As you walk out, there's a sign-up sheet outside. If you're not on my mailing list and would like to be and receive information about the events that we have here for English speakers, both here at the Bacon Centre and on Zoom. And again, get your signed copy of Richard's book. The details are outside of how to order that, pay for it with Bit or Paybox or WhatsApp. Modern technology. You can also go to Kupperwasser itself from Thursday and buy a copy there. Sorry, sir? Yes. Oh, so the gentleman asked us to be on YouTube. Yes, it's going to be recorded. It's going to be on YouTube. If you're on my mailing list or you join my mailing list, you'll get the link. Or you can email me, callg@baconcenter.org, and get the link. Thank you very much.
Cannot read it.